Hello, everybody. I'm Bennett Marks of the Authors at Google team. First, let me say that if you think that we're going to be discussing the television show Grey's Anatomy, you are in the wrong room, and I'm sure there's places you can go to discuss that. We are very fortunate to have with us today Bill Hayes, whose latest book, The Anatomist, is basically a biography of the famous and still used medical reference book, Grey's Anatomy, which is 150 years old now. It's a fascinating story. He dug out details that are not well known. Previous books of his include the best-selling Sleep Demons, an insomniac's memoir, so we feel a little sorry for him. And Five Quarts, A Personal and Natural History of Blood, which is a biography of blood, his and mine and yours. So these are very interesting subjects. He's a very interesting author. Bill Hayes.
Thank you. I want to say a special thanks to Jennifer Brooks, my first ever Google fan, for inviting me, and to Bennett, and to Ann Farmer, and to my friend Jesse for hosting today. And I should also thank Google itself. You know, when I was driving down, I was remembering that when I was writing the acknowledgments page for The Anatomist, I came this close to thanking Google in the acknowledgments, because I literally could not have written this book without Google and the research I did on the book. As Bennett said, this is my third book. The first, Sleep Demons, a memoir about insomnia, then Five Quarts, and The Anatomist, which came out in January. All of my books mix medical or scientific history with personal narrative. And The Anatomist, like the others really, took 3 years to write from start to finish. But as I explain in the prologue to the book, it was really many more years in the making. Looking back, I can see how my whole life has led to this. A book about anatomy, and about the education of an anatomist, albeit an amateur one. Sigmund Freud was right, it turns out. Anatomy is destiny, or mine at least. A bloom in a boulder crack, my fascination with human anatomy took root in the less than accommodating conditions of a strict Irish Catholic upbringing in the 1960s. You are made in God's image, I remember being told by the nuns in catechism class, which struck me as wonderful news. To cherish your body was to cherish the Creator. At the same time, though, the story of Adam and Eve made it frighteningly clear that the body is a shameful vessel for sin. Even today, while I no longer consider myself Catholic or even religious, the tale of their fall from innocence haunts me. God warning Adam, "You shall die if you eat of the tree of knowledge." And then Eve, poor gullible Eve, sweet-talked by the snake, pulling an apple from the tree. I still just want to stop her. Then the eyes of both were opened, the Bible story reads, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together. Banishment from the garden was but one part of their sentence. You are dust, God tells them, and to dust you shall return. The moral, simple enough for a child to grasp, is that when God says no, he really means no. But the story also conveys a more insidious notion. Awareness of the body may lead to spiritual death. To the 8-year-old me, fresh from making my first holy confession, Adam and Eve were especially effective in promoting the idea that nakedness went hand in hand with sin. And yet, making matters morally confusing, there were some naked people it was okay to look at, whose nakedness you were meant to take notice of, beginning, ironically enough, with Adam and Eve. Even in my children's Bible, those two appeared as delectable as a couple of ripe, red, delicious apples. The most frequent naked body I saw while growing up, though, belonged to Jesus. In our house, crucifixes were as common as light fixtures. A small bronze one hung above my bed, and I prayed to it every night. But in a curious design choice, as I think of it now, the largest crucifix was posted right outside the bathroom my 5 sisters and I shared. Jesus, as if clad in a towel rather than a loincloth, appeared to be waiting his turn for the shower. I can still recall every detail of that crucifix, a wooden one my dad had bought in Mexico. The body was carved with such care so that legs and arms were finely muscled and veined, and the torso made long and sinuous. His nakedness exposed every crucifixion wound and was crucial to reinforcing a central tenet of the church. The gash along his ribs was due to our sin. The trickle of blood down his forehead was our fault. Christ's pain was meant to cause you the same. His death, we were never meant to forget, was for us. Now, providing a ballast to the Irish Catholicism of my father was my mother. Mom had once been an aspiring painter in New York City before meeting Dad, and she wasn't Catholic. Only on the rarest occasions did Mom join us at church. I remember how every year on Ash Wednesday, the first day of Lent, when a thumb press of ash was pressed on your forehead as a reminder of your mortality, Mom's unsmudged brow marked her as unlike my father and sisters and me. Dad would jokingly call her a heathen, but almost in the same breath say earnestly to his 6 children, Mom's a saint. That's why she doesn't need to go to Mass. To me, Mom represented the everyday, but also another higher world, a world of artists, of passionate, driven people, a world I glimpsed in her little library of art books. Above the table where her sewing machine sat was a pine wood bookshelf that held histories of famous painters, as well as catalogs from far-off places like the Museum of Modern Art in New York. While the book Picasso's only confused me, the thick tomes on Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Matisse introduced me to the sensual body as art. These books were full of nudes, not naked people, a distinction I began to understand as I edged toward puberty. Now, lining the shelf on the opposite wall was our 1965 World Book Encyclopedia. 22 volumes, straight-spined and orderly like the cadets in a photo nearby, the 1949 graduating class of West Point, with my dad standing third from the left, front row. Now, it was in World Book Volume H that I got my first peek inside the human body. Between entries on hairstyling and hysterectomy, there was a spectacular anatomical illustration composed of 10 bright, transparent overlays. The body illustrated was male, although in a nod to modesty, no genitalia were shown. To this day, I still recall the smell of the plastic sheets and the sticky sound they made when you turned each overlay. Sometimes I would run up to one of my sisters and flash Encyclopedia Man in her face, eliciting a guaranteed ick. But we would then often sit down and look at the illustrations together, drawn into the illusion of a deep body adventure, as though we wore X-ray specs that actually worked. Paging from left to right performed a crude dissection, salmon-colored muscle giving way to the wet worms of viscera, giving way to less and less and less, until finally, on the last transparency, only the unadorned skeleton remained. My 2 best friends' dads were both doctors, one a GP, one a dermatologist. Their family bookshelves held volumes that I would never be able to find, even at the Spokane Public Library, old medical textbooks. Kept on topmost shelves, they were meant to be out of reach, out of sight, which is, of course, exactly why I would urge Chris or Andy to go fetch them. What I will never forget is the deformities and disfigurements pictured, photos as artless as mugshots, of elephantiasis, leprosy, gargantuan tumors. Indeed, I think it intensified in direct proportion to my burgeoning interest in sex. But by the time I was actually having sex, after moving to San Francisco in the early 1980s, the body had turned virtually overnight into something to fear, a vessel not for mortal sin, but for a deadly virus. That was when I bought my first copy of Gray's Anatomy. I got it for the pictures. Hundreds of drawings of lean muscle, bones, and organs, each meticulously rendered and labeled as if it were a rare entomology specimen. Lying on a bookstore table, the thick volume's cover image had first drawn me in. A profile of a man whose face is intact, but whose neck is not, to put it mildly. The skin from the chin to the collarbone is missing, revealing strips of muscle and a tangle of blood vessels. As gruesome as it was, I found the image incongruously beautiful. The young man wore such a serene expression, and there was something so intimate in his pose, the way his head was gently turned to expose every detail, as if in invitation. Here, come closer, take a look. Marked down to $9.95, the book was also a deal I couldn't pass up. Gray's Anatomy, like Bulfinch's Mythology or Plato's Republic, seemed like a classic every person should have, if only just to have. So I bought a copy. This was about half my life ago. Now, aside from occasionally spell-checking anatomical terms while writing my 2 previous books, I ended up using the book most often to ID parts on their way out. A good friend's cancerous pancreas, my sister's uterus at the time of her hysterectomy, my boyfriend's pituitary gland tumor. Being able to picture the affected organs helped put those surgeries into clearer focus. Gray's Anatomy became like the list of emergency numbers taped next to the phone, good in a crisis. Whenever I use the book, though, its language, the opposite of lyrical, always impressed me. No detail seemed too small to be harpooned with a handful of finely honed sentences. Such occasions, though, were few and far between. Like my copy of Bulfinch's Mythology, Gray's mainly collected dust on a shelf. One day, a few years ago, however, I pulled it out to double-check a spelling, and as I paged through the text, the word in question slipped from my mental grasp, and a new thought surfaced. Who wrote this thing? So that was really how this book started, with that simple question. Who wrote this thing? And my first impulse was to go to the computer and go to the San Francisco Public Library online catalog and just see if there was a biography. I didn't find a biography of Henry Gray. And I can tell you that right at that moment, the writerly wheels started turning. So I thought, that's interesting. Then probably the next thing I did was to log on to Google and look up Henry Gray and see what I could find out. I learned that he was an anatomist and a surgeon, an anatomy lecturer in mid-19th century England, that he'd gone to St. George's Medical School. One of the most surprising things I learned, though, was that he did not do the drawings for which the book is so famous, the drawings that I had been first so interested in. That it was another Henry, a man named Henry Carter, also an anatomist, also a surgeon, a gifted artist who had done the drawings, but his name had been left out of all later editions of the book, including the American editions. Unfortunately, I didn't find any archives in my searching, my Googling, for Henry Gray. It looked like there was virtually nothing left behind by the man. But I did find that there was a trove of diaries, letters, papers, manuscripts left by Henry Carter. So by this point, I felt like I have a story, I have 2 characters, I have a subject I'm interested in, but the one thing I don't have is any knowledge of anatomy. I have no formal medical background. I come to my books and all of my work just as a layperson. So I thought, well, I should know something about anatomy if I'm going to write a biography of this man. And I called up UCSF Medical School. I got a very sympathetic receptionist. I told her what this idea I had. She connected me to the anatomy department. I ended up talking to the head of the department, and she said, yeah, you can sit in on a few lectures if you'd like. In fact, we're starting a new course, and it starts on Monday. So she said, you're welcome to come. So I went to the first lecture. It was completely over my head. And this was for a 6-week course in anatomy for med students. And she invited me to come up to the lab after that first lecture, and I followed them up. And, well, let me just read to you what that first day was like, okay? On the first day of class, I'm mistaken for a teaching assistant 6 times, which on the one hand simply tells me I'm old, a good 20 years older than the average student, but on the other hand seems to imply that I look as if I belong. Choosing the glass half full, I smile through each mistaken identity. The class size is 120, 150 if you count the cadavers. We had been warned beforehand that some students are overwhelmed by the first sight of the dead bodies, and sure enough, some students clearly are. But I'm more freaked out by that woman in the gas mask. What does she know that the rest of us don't? Class, hello, comes a disembodied voice, tinnily amplified. This is Sexton Sutherland, one of the 3 professors for this 10-week course in gross anatomy, though I can't see him for the crowd. Before we get started, he says, some housekeeping rules. No eating your lunch in here. This elicits a collective ooh. No music. Please don't take any pictures, and try to keep your voices down. Laughter's okay, Dr. Sutherland adds. It's a great way to release emotion, but not at the expense of the wonderful people who've donated their bodies to our program. He lets that sink in for a moment. Okay, he says, let's get going. So 6 of us arrange ourselves around cadaver number 4. But rather than looking at the naked female body lying before us, we all stare at one another. Finally, one of the 3 women breaks the ice. I haven't dissected anything since high school biology, she admits. And that was a frog. This seems like the right moment to make an admission of my own. I should tell you, I explain, I'm not a student here. I'm doing research for a book on Henry Gray and Henry Carter, and I've gotten permission to attend your lectures and labs. I'm just going to be an observer, I tell them. All but one of them look as though they would pay to change places with me. The exception, a tall, husky, hairy guy named Gergen, who says he has never dissected anything in his life, cheerfully volunteers to begin. Now, our cadaver was partially dissected during a previous course, so the first task is simply to unpack the earlier work. Gergen folds back the 2 panels of skin incised atop the chest, then grasps the edges of the underlying breastplate, a solid shield of ribs and muscle that have been pre-cut with a surgical saw. He lifts, and a powerful wave of fumes escapes from the cadaver, making all of us flinch. Gergen, now greenish, appears on the verge of losing his cool and perhaps his lunch, so Amy agrees to take over. I read aloud from the lab guide as she picks up a scalpel and makes a large, neat, cross-shaped cut atop the pericardium, the opaque protective sac that encloses the heart. She peels back each flap, exposing the heart, then reaches for a larger blade. Amy looks so comfortable using a scalpel that I can't resist asking if she's ever thought about becoming a surgeon. Not until now, she answers with a smile. Amy slices through the blood vessels entering and exiting the hearts, puts down the knife, grasps the heart with both hands, and tugs, uprooting the organ from its bedding in the chest. Switching to a fine blade, she makes a small doorway into the right atrium and a larger opening in the left ventricle. Now, one of the other instructors, Dana Rode, has been observing how we're doing, and she comes over and suggests that someone take the heart to the sink and rinse it out. I volunteer. With an air of quiet ceremony, Amy places the heart into my gloved hands, and I instinctively draw it to my chest. My own heart instantly speeds up. The lab suddenly seems terribly crowded. The distance to that big stainless steel sink, vast. I feel as if I'm carrying the most fragile thing in the world, which is actually really silly because our cadaver actually died of heart failure. Our heart is already broken, in a sense. Once I begin rinsing the heart, though, cradling it with one hand while rubbing it with the other, I relax. It's tough and rubbery. The aorta, the major artery emerging from the heart, it's like a severed garden hose. And the smaller blood vessels, once thought to be heartstrings that actually keep the heart in place and can be tugged or plucked to elicit different emotions, well, they're like the roots of a turnip. What washes down the drain is a grainy brown paste, coagulated blood. I pat the heart dry and return to our table. Now, you cannot hold a human heart without questioning how it ever became known as the center of emotion, or as the 16th century French surgeon Ambrose Paré once grandly described it, the chief mansion of the soul, the organ of the vital faculty, the fountain of the vital spirits. To me, the heart doesn't look or feel like anything but what it is, a tough, muscular pump. But wait, not so fast. Let me show you something, Dr. Rhodes says before moving on to the next group and the next body. We crowd around her as she lifts up our heart and pulls the doorway into the right atrium as far back as it will go. Now, unfortunately, you can't actually see it, Dr. Rhodes says, but right inside here, where the superior vena cava enters the right atrium, she points to a spot right at the top of the fold. Right at that little ridge is an area where a cluster of cells is embedded. It's called the sinoatrial, or SA node, but it's known as the pacemaker. In other words, this is where your heart's speed is set. While she explains how the SA node works, how electrical signals generated by these cells spread to other cells across the heart, causing it to contract, to beat, I find myself dazzled by this perfect meeting of anatomy and metaphor. You see, in the human body, the SA node is positioned right under the sternum, dead center in the chest. So in a sense, this truly is where feelings such as terror, love, and elation are first felt, where your heart starts to race, pound, flutter. Looking up, I notice that Amy is doing exactly what I'm doing. We both stand with a hand at the center of our chests, instinctively feeling the moment. Here, right here, is where wonder begins. So for me, this was a day of firsts. First time I saw a dead body, first time I saw a cadaver, not a dead body, first time I saw a cadaver, first time I'd seen internal organs, first time I'd participated in a dissection. But there was going to be one more first on this same day, and I'm going to finish with a short passage, another short passage from the Anatomist. After class, I crossed Parnassus Avenue and moved from the realm of rubber gloves to white cotton ones, from the dissection laboratory to the special collections room of UCSF's medical library. I have an appointment with a first edition. Up 2 flights of stairs, the jewel box of a room is climate controlled and silent, and save for the librarian and me, empty. Ms. Wheat retreats to a back room in her familiar way and reappears moments later. I love this almost ceremonial aspect of our visits, the way she approaches my table with the requested volume in her gloved hands, as if she were a sommelier cradling a rare vintage. With a whispered thank you, I nod in approval as she places before me an 1858 copy of Gray's Anatomy. The book rests on a large foam pad, angled like a lectern, but deeper near the center to minimize stress on the spine. For a 150-year-old book, it's in amazingly good shape. As I admire the pristine brown leather cover, I pull on the thin white gloves Ms. Wheat has left me, and I can't help but notice how similar they are to the ones my sisters wore to their first Holy Communion. I crack open the cover and turn the pages. This releases the faint, earthy scent unique to very old books, a smell I happen to like, a scent preserved from another time. Although his book has assumed the mantle of a classic, Henry Gray wrote it for a most prosaic purpose, to satisfy a pressing need for new medical textbooks. The demand was driven by several factors, but the most compelling was the discovery of anesthesia in its earliest form, chloroform. Nowadays, when going under the knife is a phrase that slipped into casual conversation and surgery is entertainment on reality shows, it's hard to imagine how revolutionary it was to suddenly have the ability to safely put patients under, to be able to cut into their flesh without their feeling that burn of the blade. Prior to this innovation, the field of surgery was chiefly concerned with, as paradoxical as this sounds, external medicine, what the doctor could see or easily feel under the skin, whether this was a boil to lance, rotten tooth to pull, or gangrenous limb to remove. Since the patient was conscious, a surgeon had to be dexterous and, above all, speedy. With the use of anesthesia, though, operating theaters became quieter, doctors could take more time, and an all-new terrain opened up. As never before, doctors had access to heretofore unreachable areas of the body. Consequently, the scope of what a student had to learn grew exponentially, hence the need for an exhaustive encyclopedia such as Gray's Anatomy. Of course, anatomy texts had been around for more than 500 years by this point. Henry Gray was not inventing the wheel here. And in fact, several decent textbooks were already available. But Gray had clear ideas on how to make a better book, and a commercially successful one. The main selling point would be its emphasis on surgical anatomy. This alone would make Gray's a great buy. His author credit forms 2 lines on the title page, bold and capped. Henry Gray, lecturer on anatomy at St. George's Hospital. For me, seeing it in its original form is equivalent to being formally introduced to this man whom, till now, I'd only known from a distance. I tear a scrap of paper to mark the page and nearly give Ms. Weed a coronary. Her expression is somewhere between cat in bathwater and teacher on edge. With a pursed expression, she promptly delivers to my left hand a pile of pre-cut page markers. Now, I brought with me to the library my own copy of Gray's, a 1901 facsimile, so I could compare them side by side. And not surprisingly, I find subtle text differences between the 1858 and 1901 editions. In the latter, words are substituted, sentences shortened, punctuation changed. But one thing is exactly the same in both editions. The book comes to an abrupt conclusion. It's almost as though Professor Henry Gray, in the midst of lecturing, sees that he's gone past his allotted time, his words quickly grind to a halt, and that's that. Class dismissed. But in the first edition, 2 last words appear in tiny print. The end. As I sit in the library, those 2 little words sound wonderfully ironic to me. Could Henry Gray ever have imagined what the end would begin? The long life his work would enjoy. Having never gone out of print, it's to date seen 35 editions in the US alone. It's been translated into more than a dozen languages, been pored over by generation after generation of med students, and sold millions of copies. I try to imagine what was going through his head when early in 1858, Henry Gray put the finishing touches to his tome. I picture him sitting at a meticulously organized desk in the Gray family home on Wilton Street, where he lived with his widowed mother. The hundreds of handwritten manuscript pages are stacked in a neat tower, ready to be boxed up for the publisher, when the 31-year-old Henry gets bitten by whimsy. He pulls out a fresh sheet of paper and with his most careful calligraphy writes those two last words. He slips this final page into the bottom of the stack. He doesn't expect it to survive the editing process. This is his attempt at a little joke. The end? Yeah, right. A book ends, a story ends, a life ends. But the desire to study anatomy never will. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks. It's wonderful to hear you actually reading from the book because it's a delightful book to read. And I have a question that comes up in the anatomy studies and in sort of how people interpret physical evidence in general, which is cranial nerve 0 is under some dispute. It's one of these little tiny nerves that projects from the bottom of the brainstem forward, and it's whether or not the question is whether or not it really exists. Right? And no, I haven't checked my copy of Gray's. I don't actually know, but I presume that it wasn't in there.
Right.
So one of the questions is, how could people overlook this tiny? I know it's small, but it's a nerve that extends from the brainstem forward, potentially a very important nerve. And the reason I'm thinking about it is because oftentimes when people are doing descriptive anatomies, they will tend to see into the world their preconceptions of the world.
Right.
And so, for example, Stephen Jay Gould talks about something similar in his book, A Wonderful Life, when he's talking about the British Shale, about how generations of paleontologists sketched animals in a particular way because they matched their preconceptions of those animals, ignoring the evidence they saw before them. So it's a long-winded way to ask. When you were with the students actually going through this dissection, to what extent did you have to overcome sort of the preconceptions of the anatomy versus what you actually saw? And to what extent is that a hurdle to overcome, or is it just the natural condition of people trying to actually deal with anatomy?
I think you really do. I mean, you come to it with your own biases and neuroses and phobias. And the thing that was so amazing about attending all those anatomy classes, and I attended anatomy classes over a full year, going through 3 consecutive courses, each one different, was how every day there was a surprise. You would come expecting to learn one thing, and you would see something else. And it would challenge your ideas about the body and change your ideas about the body. And that's one of the most amazing things I took away from it. How I have this kind of library of images in my head inside the body, and it's not literally like I now can wear X-ray specs and see through all of you as you're sitting there. But you do have that, so that everything you do, whether it's sit or run or walk or take a pee, suddenly becomes illustrated in a different way. As I said, I came to it with literally no background in anatomy, and this is going to sound really naive, but I was most surprised by the nervous system and nerves, because I just never had a conception of what they would look like or that they would even be visible. And, here in the very first dissections, you're dissecting nerves, and, some of them are huge, as big as, like, telephone cables, like these cables here. And very distinct from arteries and blood vessels, and you learn to tell them apart, even though they kind of look similar. So it was constantly surprising, which kept me coming back day after day after day for a year, even though sometimes, it was kind of hard to take.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I was wondering, what was the most surprising thing you learned about Gray himself?
The most surprising thing about Gray, I don't think I mentioned that he died just 3 years after the book came out. He died of smallpox, which was surprising because there was a vaccine and he had been vaccinated. But he was caring for a small nephew who had smallpox. The nephew survived to an old age. Gray died within 1 week. I think, so that was surprising. And then I think really the biggest surprise to me was that he didn't do the drawings. I had just always assumed he had done the drawings. I mean, most people do. But that it was this other man, this other Henry, who ended up having this really interesting life story and who lived a long life. He lived up to his late 60s. And in some ways, the book I wrote becomes more his story than Gray's, because Henry Carter actually left London before Gray's Anatomy even came out. He moved to Bombay, where he joined up with the army in order to fight in the Indian Mutiny. And Henry Carter was many things. He was born a gifted artist. He was just naturally gifted. He was a great surgeon. He was a talented anatomist. But he was definitely not born to be a soldier. And they discovered that very quickly, took him from the front lines, and transferred him to a medical college in Bombay, where I discovered he ended up using Gray's Anatomy, the book he had illustrated, in his courses. And he stayed in Bombay and became a fairly well-known medical researcher. But he also, I discovered through his diaries, became involved in this very scandalous, for the time, affair that nearly ruined his reputation and that provides some really juicy storytelling for my book. Now, it was only because of those diaries that I learned about it, and with my late partner, I had spent about a year going through these diaries and transcribing them and deciphering them, because he wrote in code and in abbreviations. And like a lot of doctors, he had really lousy handwriting. But I not only learned about his private life, his sexual desires, his struggles with religion, but also about his relationship with Henry Gray and about the actual writing of and illustrating of Gray's Anatomy, because Gray left virtually nothing behind. And that was another thing you asked about. This mystery of why there was nothing left behind. I mean, I'd actually talked to other writers who had attempted biographies of Henry Gray, but given up. Because there was barely, I think there's one note, but nothing else has survived. And that was another mystery I sort of tracked down, and I come up with a theory in the book. But I'm going to make you read it to find out why, about what happened to all of his papers and diaries.
In medical training, to what extent does the anatomy class weed people out? Is that a barrier that some students can't get over?
He asked if the anatomy class is kind of a barrier that weeds people out. I wouldn't really say so, but it's definitely still a rite of passage for medical students. It's the first course they take, and they have to get through it. I don't think I ever ran into a student who dropped out of med school because of anatomy, but it was really tough for some of them.
I've actually got two fairly unrelated questions.
Okay.
One is, how many of your friends and family now come to you for medical advice?
It happens a lot, yeah. And it's not as if I remember everything, you know. I did the anatomy classes several years ago, so it's memory goes.
So I had an anatomy class in college that was anatomy and physiology.
Mm-hmm.
The teacher saying that the difference was physiology is what the anatomy does when it moves around.
Mm-hmm.
How much do your anatomy classes touch on physiology specifically? No?
Yeah, not at all.
Just bodies lying on the table?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
And could you talk a little bit here about the differences between the 3 anatomy classes you attended?
Sure. I did take 3 anatomy classes consecutively. One was expressly for med students, so it was covering the entire body and all the systems. I did one for pharmacy students, which was more, I guess that was more system and organ related. And then one, surprisingly enough, for physical therapy students. And in a sense, that was the toughest course of them all. It was focusing on neuromuscular anatomy. It was very intensive. The teacher happened to be especially tough. And I think that was the one where I actually took a midterm, something I hadn't done before. And I did get an F. I'm not ashamed to admit. The only reason I'll admit it is that there were 3 students who did worse than me. So I didn't feel too bad. So yeah, I did physical therapy, pharmacy, and med students. And I follow each of them in the book. So it goes back and forth between the story of Gray and Carter and my continuing education in anatomy, where I get to the point where I'm actually doing full cadaver dissection, recreating or trying to recreate what Gray and Carter did 150 years ago. And learning that it's not just a science, but an art. And then I also did a follow-up course on brain anatomy. So it was an amazing privilege and education.
I wondered, did you go to the Bodies exhibition? I didn't go to it myself, and what do you think of that bringing anatomy to everybody else?
Yeah, she asked about the Bodies exhibition. Does everyone know? I'm glad you asked. I get asked this a lot. I avoided seeing it for years, I guess. And I was working on the book and in anatomy labs, and I sort of thought, I've already seen this, and I stayed away too because I thought it would be kind of very vulgar and crass. But I did eventually go after the book was finished, and I was completely surprised. I saw both exhibits. They're kind of 2 rival exhibits. And it was much more educational than I expected. Certainly, there were aspects of it that were sensational and gratuitous, but overall, I thought it was really educational, presented in an educational way. And though I know there's a lot of controversy, especially with one of the exhibits about where the bodies came from, what impressed me most was the attention paid by the visitors and the kind of reverence paid by the visitors and how interested and fascinated people were to learn about their own bodies. And I was really impressed.
I'm curious about what would be different if Gray's Anatomy were being done for the first time now. I mean, are there things that were sort of misinterpreted, or I mean, if it's just straight reportage, it would be probably the same. But my guess is that there are things that would be different, and wonder what those are.
Well, there's just so much more now. He asked if Gray's Anatomy were written today. In fact, Gray's Anatomy is still published under that name. I think it's in the 39th edition. Still carries that name, but it has virtually not a single word of Henry Gray's or any of Henry Carter's illustrations. It's completely different, just as you would expect. With it comes with a CD-ROM and a DVD and computer-generated imagery, and it's beautiful and it's huge. And it contains so much more about the body and goes into the biochemistry of the body. And it's not so much that Henry Gray and Carter made mistakes, but there are a lot of anachronisms in the book. The language is certainly anachronistic. I honestly think I'm one of the few people who's actually read the entire thing from cover to cover, at least in this day and age. So that it's really just that there is so much more and so much more detail, and there's more of an effort to apply anatomy to practice and diagnosis and incorporate it into the practice of medicine.
And did you remember those World Book Encyclopedia things, or did you have to go back and look?
You know, I was going to bring this up as I was talking, but I couldn't reach for my prop. Ann Farmer, who helped organize this event, brought for me her very own copy of World Book Encyclopedia, Volume H. This is identical to the one I grew up with. And for those who want to come up and look afterwards, or a lot of you probably remember, here we go. This is what haunted me my whole life. But the same plastic overlays. where you can dissect and show it to your sisters, you know. But when I was writing the book, I remembered it vividly, but I thought, God, I would love to see it just so I can describe it, really make sure it wasn't like a figment of my imagination. So I wrote my parents, who are quite elderly. They still had it. They dug up volume H and sent it to me, so I have this at home as well. Any other questions?
Just one other. In some sense, a book like that tends to give you the normative view, right? The heart sits here, the sinus is there, and so on. But the reality is that there's a lot of individual variation.
Yeah.
And so how have you seen that change over the course from the early 19th century versions of this down to what the present? I haven't seen the present volume, so does that cover the range of variations?
In the human body?
Yeah.
I'm not sure the book does, but certainly you brought up a really good point. I'm not sure the book does, but certainly the course does. And it's one of the important things they emphasize in anatomy class, that there may be 30 or 50 cadavers in the lab, and you're assigned one cadaver that you work on over the period of the class. But it's really important to go and look at the other bodies, because every body is different. And there were bodies, where the heart was not on the left side, but it was on the right side. And variations in the way the nerves run. So they always emphasize that. And when people had bodies that had some special difference, that was really interesting to see. And then, of course, there are bodies that have had different diseases, or, you see different things just based on the lives that these people led. So it's really interesting and important to see those differences. Mm-hmm. So what's next? What can we look forward to reading by you 3 years from now? What's next? I'm actually not working on a book right now, which is kind of unusual for me. I wrote the 3 books pretty much back to back over a 9-year period. And I guess I'm taking a break. I'm working on little things. I just did a book review for the New York Times. I'm working on essays. And I'm a big believer in the theory of crop rotation. So I'm actually been focusing on photography and exploring photography, which is new for me, just to keep my creative life alive. And I'm sure I'll write another book, but I don't know what it will be. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.